Job and the silence of God. Faith in the midst of suffering. There are moments in life when the sky seems closed, when prayers rise but find no echo, when pain fills the air, and even the whisper of divine comfort fades into distance. In such seasons, the soul trembles. Faith, once strong and vibrant, begins to question itself. Why does the righteous suffer? Why does God remain silent when the heart bleeds for an answer? These questions are as old as humanity itself, and perhaps no story captures them with greater power and beauty than the story of Job. The book of Job stands at the heart of the human struggle with divine silence. It is not merely a tale about one man's suffering, it is a mirror of the soul confronting the mystery of God's hiddenness. Job was not a sinner deserving punishment. He was called blameless and upright. Yet in a single sequence of tragedies, he lost everything: his wealth, his health, his children, his sense of meaning. What followed was a long journey through anguish, confusion, and silence. The silence of God is not the absence of God. It is the space where faith is tested, refined, and revealed for what it truly is. Job's story reminds us that faith is not built on answers, but on trust. When God speaks clearly, trust is easy, but when he is silent, faith must learn to breathe in the dark. This journey is not about theology alone. It is about the lived experience of every human being who has ever cried out and heard nothing in return. To understand Job is to understand something essential about ourselves. Our limits, our pain, our longing for meaning in chaos. It is also to encounter a profound truth, that God's silence can be sacred, even transformative. It invites us to stand still, to listen beyond words, and to discover that the divine presence is sometimes found most powerfully, not in the thunder, but in the stillness after the storm. This work explores 5 dimensions of Job's ordeal, each revealing a deeper layer of what it means to keep faith in the midst of suffering. We begin where all suffering begins, in the sudden collapse of what once felt secure, the moment when the world as we knew it is shattered, and silence begins its reign. When everything falls apart. The testing of the soul, suffering, rarely announces itself with warning. It arrives uninvited, cutting through the rhythm of ordinary days, dismantling the structures we rely upon for stability. For Job, the catastrophe came with devastating speed. In a single day, messengers came one after another bearing news of destruction. Oxen stolen, servants slain, sheep consumed by fire, camels raided, and finally, the blow no parent can bear, the death of his children. In one breath, prosperity turned to ruin, joy to mourning. The first movement of Job's story is not philosophical, it is human. It is the scream of grief when the heart cannot comprehend what has happened. The text describes how Job tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground in worship. Worship, not despair. Yet this act is not simple submission. It is a paradoxical expression of faith that clings to God even when life itself has turned into ash. Job says, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." These words have echoed across centuries as a testimony of courage, but they also conceal an agony that words can hardly contain. To lose is to be stripped of identity. Our possessions, relationships, and health are often extensions of our sense of self. When they vanish, what remains? Job's loss is not merely material, it is existential. It exposes the fragility of the human condition. The book forces us to face the uncomfortable truth that security is an illusion. We can plan, build, and guard, but life is always vulnerable to forces beyond our control. In this sense, Job's story speaks universally. Everyone, sooner or later, faces a moment when everything falls apart. But what makes Job's response extraordinary is not denial of pain. It is the refusal to let pain define the boundaries of faith. He grieves honestly, he questions, he laments, yet he does not curse God. This is the first lesson in enduring silence. Faith is not the absence of sorrow, but the decision to remain faithful amid sorrow. In our culture, we are taught to equate faith with victory, peace, or certainty. But Job teaches a different kind of faith, one that can exist alongside confusion and despair. The testing of the soul does not begin when suffering comes. It begins when meaning disappears. Many can endure pain if they can understand it, but Job's trial is the darkness of not knowing why. The friends who visit him later will try to explain his suffering through moral logic. Surely he must have sinned. But Job knows that is false. His torment lies precisely in the dissonance between his innocence and his affliction. It is this dissonance that pushes him into dialogue with the silence of God. Silence, however, is not emptiness. It is the unseen work of grace in the depths of the spirit. When God is silent, the soul is forced to search beyond formulas and rituals, to confront its nakedness before the infinite. Job's silence, filled with cries and questions, becomes a sacred space where genuine faith is born. The superficial faith of comfort cannot survive in the desert of divine silence. Only faith refined by suffering can endure. In the ruins of his former life, Job represents every believer who has ever asked, "Where are you, God?" His wounds are our own. His questions echo ours, and yet hidden within his endurance is a secret, that suffering can strip away illusions and bring us closer to truth. Job's story reveals that the foundation of faith is not understanding, but relationship. A relationship that persists even when communication breaks down. Job continues to speak to God, even if he hears nothing back. He argues, pleads, demands. But he does not walk away. To stand in faith when everything collapses is to affirm that life still has meaning, even when it cannot be seen. It is to trust that silence is not rejection, but mystery. The silence of God is not an answer withheld. It is an invitation to go deeper, to see beyond the visible, to rediscover that the heart of faith lies not in clarity, but in trust. The first step, then, in learning from Job is to accept that suffering is part of the human condition and that God's silence in our pain does not mean his absence. The same silence that seems to destroy faith can paradoxically become the womb in which faith is reborn. Job's story is not the end of belief. It is the beginning of a more mature, resilient, and honest one. If you find strength in these reflections, remember to subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring faith, wisdom, and the endurance of the human spirit together. The silence of heaven, when God does not answer. There comes a moment in the life of every believer when prayer feels like talking into the void. The words rise, yet no answer returns. The heavens that once seemed open and full of presence now appear sealed. In the story of Job, this silence is not temporary. It stretches heavy and unbearable across long chapters of lament and dialogue. Job cries out again and again, demanding that God explain his absence. "I cry out to you, O God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me." These words pierce the human heart because they describe a universal experience, the aching distance between divine power and human pain. The silence of heaven is not simply the lack of sound, it is the collapse of meaning. It unsettles the mind because we assume that a just God should speak, should act, should comfort those who suffer unjustly. When he does not, the pillars of faith tremble. Job's friends attempt to fill the silence with explanations. They insist that Job must have sinned. Their logic is the logic of a moral universe. Bad things happen to bad people, good things to good people. But Job knows this formula does not hold. He rejects their comfort because it is false comfort. Their speeches, though clothed in pious language, are ultimately attempts to protect themselves from the terror of divine silence. If Job's suffering is not caused by sin, then the world is not predictable, and that possibility is unbearable. Job, on the other hand, refuses the easy explanation. He prefers the chaos of truth to the order of a lie. In his refusal, he becomes a prophet of integrity. He will not speak falsely about God, even if it costs him peace. This is the spiritual courage that silence demands, the willingness to face uncertainty without fabricating meaning. The book of Job teaches that silence is not always punishment. Sometimes it is revelation in disguise. God's silence is the testing ground of faith's authenticity. When the voice of heaven withdraws, what remains is the naked heart before the infinite. In those long, empty nights of unanswered prayer, Job's humanity is stripped to its essence. He becomes the symbol of every soul that has cried into the dark, yet within his anguish, something extraordinary begins to happen. Job's vision of God deepens. The God he once knew through ritual and prosperity becomes the God he must now seek through pain and mystery. Suffering transforms the way he perceives divinity. When God was near, Job's faith was transactional. He offered worship, and blessings followed. When God is silent, faith becomes relational. It persists not because of reward, but because of love. The silence of heaven forces Job to question everything he thought he knew. He revisits his theology, his moral assumptions, even his identity. This questioning is not rebellion, it is honesty. True faith does not fear questions. The silence of God invites them. Job's dialogues with his friends are filled with frustration, but they are also filled with depth. He wrestles with the idea of justice, with the nature of suffering, with the limits of human understanding. His cry is not merely for relief, but for meaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. This is the essence of spiritual longing, the desire to encounter truth even when it wounds. In the midst of silence, the human mind often seeks to interpret. We imagine God's absence as punishment, his stillness as indifference, but the silence of heaven is often the language of transformation. When God does not answer, he is often inviting the soul into a different kind of relationship, a relationship no longer built on comprehension, but on surrender. Faith at its core is not certainty but trust. Silence teaches this truth more profoundly than words ever could. It trains the soul to endure without understanding, to love without receiving, to believe without seeing. Throughout the narrative, Job continues to speak. He does not stop praying. His prayers are raw, sometimes accusatory, sometimes reverent, but he keeps the dialogue alive. In this persistence lies the seed of redemption. The silence of heaven cannot destroy the faith that keeps calling into it. Job's endurance becomes the true act of worship. In the absence of divine response, his cry becomes the holiest sound on earth, the sound of faith refusing to die. One of the most haunting aspects of the book is how God seems to watch silently as Job's world collapses. The reader knows that this suffering is not meaningless. It is a cosmic test, a drama of divine trust. Yet Job himself does not know this. He lives inside the mystery. This is what makes his faith heroic. He remains loyal to a God who offers him no explanation. In modern times, we often seek quick comfort, psychological reassurance, and visible signs of God's care. Job offers something far deeper. His story invites us to live with unanswered questions, to find holiness even in silence. As Job's laments continue, the silence begins to change its texture. It is no longer pure absence. Something in it begins to move, a quiet undercurrent of presence that cannot yet be spoken. The silence of heaven becomes the space where Job's words ripen, where his anger and grief are slowly transformed into awe. There are moments when Job seems to sense that the silence itself might be God's way of preparing him for revelation. The noise of the world has been stripped away, leaving only the trembling heartbeat of existence. It is here, in the hollow between question and answer, that the divine mystery begins to take shape. The human spirit, when faced with divine silence, stands before two choices: despair or trust. Despair says that silence means abandonment. Trust says that silence hides purpose. Job, in all his anguish, chooses the second path. Not always consciously, not always peacefully, but persistently. His faith is not serene, it is agonizing. Yet it endures. This endurance is what transforms suffering into sanctity. In silence, the believer learns to stop demanding and start receiving, to open the heart to whatever form divine presence might take, even if it is emptiness itself. The silence of heaven also exposes the limitations of human companionship. Job's friends fail him because they cannot bear to join him in the unknown. They need answers more than they need truth. True friendship in times of suffering is not about offering explanations. It is about sharing silence. The friends' speeches are filled with doctrines, but their words only deepen Job's isolation. They speak about God, but never to him. Job, however, continues to speak to God. That difference defines the entire story. Theology without relationship becomes cruelty. Job's friends use theology as a weapon to defend their worldview. Job uses faith as a lifeline to survive his darkness. In many ways, the book of Job anticipates the silence of the cross. When Christ cried, my God, why have you forsaken me?" he entered fully into the experience that Job had already lived. The silence of heaven is not unique to one story. It is the pattern of divine love that descends into human suffering without explanation. Both Job and Christ show that the truest faith is not triumphant, but wounded. It is faith that continues to trust when all evidence seems to contradict it. The silence of heaven is not a void, but a crucible in which love is purified. Job's search for meaning becomes a journey inward. As he runs out of words, as his arguments grow thin, as the explanations fail, something shifts within him. He begins to see that God's silence might not be distance, but mystery. Perhaps God's hiddenness is not rejection, but revelation in another form. The soul must grow still enough to hear it. Silence, in this sense, is not God's refusal to speak. It is his speaking in a different language, one that only the broken heart can understand. The transformation of Job's faith unfolds slowly. In the beginning, he demands justice. He wants God to appear, to argue, to justify himself. He speaks as one who still believes that righteousness should guarantee protection. But as the silence continues, Job begins to see that his understanding of God was too small. He had known God as a giver, a protector, a judge. Now he begins to sense that God is something far greater, beyond human categories of reward and punishment. The silence dismantles his theology so that something truer can be born. This is the paradox of divine silence. It destroys false images of God to make space for the real, the God of comfort, the God of transaction, the God of immediate answers. All these must die before the soul can meet the living God. Job's silence is the death of illusion. Out of that death arises a new life of faith. The silence of heaven is thus not the end of communication. It is the purification of it. When words fail, presence remains. The silence becomes the medium of divine intimacy. To endure such silence requires a deep kind of courage. It is easier to give up, to turn bitterness into armor. Many do. But Job teaches that even when the mind doubts, the heart can still reach toward God. Faith, in its most primal form, is not a conclusion, but a cry. The theologian can argue about doctrines, but the sufferer simply says, "I will not let you go until you bless me." That cry, born out of pain, is the essence of true worship. Job's refusal to abandon God, even in silence, becomes his greatest victory. The adversary had wagered that suffering would make him curse God. Instead, it purified him. The silence that seemed to destroy him became the silence that saved him. By the time God finally speaks out of the whirlwind, Job has already undergone a transformation. He no longer demands answers. The silence has done its work. He has learned to listen differently, to sense meaning beyond reason, to perceive presence beyond sound. When the divine voice finally comes, it is not an explanation, but a revelation of mystery. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? These words do not answer Job's questions. They dissolve them. The silence of heaven turns into speech, but the speech does not clarify. It awakens awe. Job understands now that God's ways are beyond measure, that his silence was not neglect, but majesty too vast for human comprehension. The story invites us to reflect on our own silences. How many times have we mistaken God's quietness for absence? How often have we filled it with our own noise, fear, complaint, distraction, rather than letting it teach us patience? The silence of heaven still falls over human lives today, in hospitals, in grief, in loneliness, in unanswered prayers. Yet within that silence, there is always the possibility of encounter. God may not answer in the way we expect, but he is never truly gone. His silence, like a deep night, conceals the dawn to come. The lesson of Job is not that silence is easy or pleasant. It is that silence can be holy. It refines the heart, exposes our dependence, humbles our pride. It reveals whether we love God for his gifts or for himself. When heaven is silent, the believer learns to rest in mystery, to live without control, to worship without demand. In that posture, faith becomes freedom. It no longer depends on explanations or outcomes. It becomes pure, a trust that survives even the absence of light. Job's endurance through divine silence is one of the greatest acts of faith in all Scripture. It stands as a reminder that when God does not speak, he is still listening. When he seems far, he is often nearest. When words fail, he teaches the soul to hear differently, to listen not for sound, but for presence. The silence of heaven, though painful, is ultimately a call to deeper communion. And so, the believer who endures silence discovers something luminous beyond it, that God's silence is not empty space, but sacred waiting. The stillness that once felt like abandonment becomes a sanctuary where the heart and the divine meet without words. Job's cry has turned into awe, his confusion into wonder, his isolation into intimacy. The silence of heaven was never a wall, it was a doorway. If this reflection helps you see faith through a deeper lens, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of this journey through divine mystery and the wisdom that sustains the soul. Wrestling with God, the sacred protest of the faithful. Job's silence does not last forever. When his grief ripens into words, those words are not gentle prayers. They are fire, questions, and defiance. He curses the day of his birth. He calls out to heaven for justice. He accuses God of cruelty, of targeting him without cause. Does it please you to oppress me, to despise the work of your hands? This cry is not blasphemy. It is honesty at its purest form. The book of Job reveals something radical about the life of faith, that to question God sincerely is not to reject him, but to seek him more deeply. In Job's protest, faith does not die. It struggles to breathe in a suffocating world. It is precisely in the wrestling that the relationship remains alive. Silence has taught Job to listen. Suffering now teaches him to speak with truth, even when truth trembles on his lips. Faith without struggle is fragile. It may appear serene on the surface, but it has never been tested. Job's faith, now raw and stripped of all illusion, becomes unshakable precisely because it refuses falsehood. He no longer worships God for blessings. He no longer trusts because of promises of reward. He holds on simply because he knows no other way to live. The protest itself is sacred because it refuses to let go. To cry out in anguish toward heaven is already to affirm that heaven matters. The God is still there, even if hidden. Job's complaint is thus an act of fidelity disguised as rebellion. In the long dialogues that follow, Job speaks to his friends and to God alternately, his words weaving between despair and reverence, accusation and surrender. There is no neat pattern, no predictable rhythm. His emotions rise and fall like waves: rage, sorrow, longing, resignation. This chaos is not a failure of faith, but the shape of faith under pressure. Too often religion teaches people to suppress their anger toward God, to silence their questions, to pretend that trust must always sound polite. But Job tears away that mask. He teaches that authentic faith includes lament. The Psalms echo this same truth. David cries, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" The prophets shout, "Why do you hide your face?" The Son of Man himself, centuries later, utters a cry of abandonment from the cross. Faith without lament is not faith, it is denial. Job's protest is the voice of a soul that knows God too well to remain silent. He refuses resignation because he believes God is better than what he sees. This paradox lies at the center of his struggle. Only a deep believer can argue with God so fiercely. The atheist does not wrestle, he turns away. The indifferent one shrugs. But Job fights because he loves, and love cannot be indifferent to injustice. His protest becomes prayer through confrontation. The ancient mystics often said that to wrestle with God is to love him deeply enough to desire his truth above one's own comfort. In that sense, Job's confrontation is an act of courage born from intimacy. The dialogues between Job and his friends become an arena where theology collapses under the weight of real suffering. Each friend represents a voice that still echoes in modern times. The moralist who insists that pain must be punishment, the optimist who says everything happens for a reason, the rationalist who wants to explain the mystery away. Job rejects them all. He will not accept a system that reduces his pain to a lesson, a transaction, or a moral formula. "Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me." In his refusal, he preserves the dignity of the human spirit before the divine mystery. He will not lie to make God seem consistent with human logic. Truth, for Job, is more sacred than comfort. This honesty becomes the birthplace of a deeper theology. Job's God is not the God of simple equations. He is vast, mysterious, free. In the whirlwind of unanswered pain, Job begins to sense a presence too immense to fit into moral calculations. This is a terrifying revelation because it means that the world is not governed by the tidy principles we prefer. Yet it is also liberating because it means that God cannot be reduced to a system. Job's struggle opens the door to a more mature faith, one that acknowledges that divine love can coexist with suffering, that justice may not always appear within human time, that mystery is not the enemy of faith, but its foundation. There is a moment in Job's speech when his anguish reaches its peak. "Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me." He wants to take God to court. He demands a hearing. This demand is not arrogance. It is the natural cry of the soul for relationship. The worst pain for Job is not the loss of wealth or even his health. It is the loss of dialogue. He can endure anything as long as he knows God is listening. Silence becomes unbearable only when it feels like abandonment. Thus, Job's lawsuit against God is, paradoxically, an act of longing for reconciliation. He does not want to destroy the relationship, he wants it restored. In the ancient world, such language was shocking. To challenge God directly was unthinkable, but the book of Job dares to record it. suggesting that such raw honesty is not a threat to faith but a vital part of it. God does not punish Job for his words. He rebukes the friends instead, saying they have not spoken rightly of him as Job has. That statement is astonishing. It means that Job's furious, wounded, desperate speech, his accusations, his laments, his questions, are closer to truth than the polished piety of his friends. In other words, God prefers honest struggle to dishonest devotion. Authenticity matters more than correctness. The soul that wrestles sincerely is more pleasing than the mouth that flatters falsely. In wrestling with God, Job embodies the human condition itself. Every sincere believer must one day face the dissonance between divine goodness and worldly suffering. To live by faith is not to escape this tension, but to live within it faithfully. The human heart longs for a God who explains everything, but the God of reality often reveals himself through silence and contradiction. The challenge, then, is not to resolve the tension, but to remain within it, to keep wrestling not as an enemy, but as a beloved, struggling to understand the beloved. This is the lesson the mystics later called the dark night of the soul. It is not punishment, it is purification. The darkness is not empty, it burns away illusion. Job's story also teaches that questioning God does not drive him away. On the contrary, it draws him near. The book's climax comes when God finally speaks, not to answer Job's arguments, but to reveal himself in majesty. The divine response does not justify Job's suffering, it overwhelms it with vision. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? The voice out of the whirlwind does not explain. It reveals that the universe is vast, alive, mysterious beyond comprehension. In that moment, Job's questions dissolve into awe. The God he had accused turns out to be far greater than the God he had defended. But before that revelation, there is the long, painful middle, the wrestling, the uncertainty, the feeling of abandonment. It is here that faith grows roots. It is here that theology becomes experience. Job's arguments are full of paradoxes. He accuses God, yet defends him. He despairs, yet hopes. He curses, yet prays. These contradictions mirror the human heart under divine pressure. To be faithful in suffering is not to be consistent, it is to be real. The truth of faith lies not in coherence, but in perseverance. In his wrestling, Job also discovers the limits of human wisdom. He realizes that reason alone cannot comprehend divine justice. Where can wisdom be found? He asks in chapter 28. The answer is both humbling and profound. The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. This verse marks a turning point. Job is no longer seeking an explanation. He is seeking reverence. The silence of God has taught him that understanding may not bring peace, but awe can. To fear God, in the biblical sense, is not terror, but recognition, an awareness of the infinite gap between creator and creature, and the humility to bow within it. The wrestling of Job becomes a mirror for our own spiritual lives. There are seasons when belief feels effortless, when prayers flow naturally, when blessings affirm our faith. But there are also seasons when faith feels like a struggle against an invisible opponent. We cry out, and the heavens remain mute. We plead for relief, and none comes. In those moments we must remember Job, not as a saint of resignation, but as a saint of perseverance. His greatness lies not in his patience alone, but in his relentless honesty. He refuses to accept falsehood, even if it would soothe him. He insists on truth, even when truth wounds. That is the path of authentic faith. The beauty of Job's struggle is that it sanctifies human emotion. Anger, grief, confusion, all become instruments of communion when offered honestly. God can handle our rage. He cannot work with our pretense. Job's story legitimizes the full spectrum of human feeling within the life of faith. There is no need to sanitize suffering or to disguise despair. The cry of pain is itself a prayer when it is directed toward God. In that cry, something sacred happens. The distance between heaven and earth collapses, not through answers but through relationship. When Job declares, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him," he articulates one of the most paradoxical confessions in all literature. It is faith without evidence, love without reward, trust without comprehension. It is the essence of what it means to believe. In that sentence, we glimpse the depth of Job's transformation. His protest has not destroyed his faith, it has purified it. He has moved from conditional trust to unconditional surrender. The God he once demanded to justify himself is now the God he loves for no reason other than love itself. In wrestling with God, Job becomes a new kind of believer, one who no longer seeks control but communion. His faith is no longer transactional, it is existential. He has learned that God's silence is not the end of the relationship, but its deepening. The same God who seemed distant is now nearer than breath. The struggle has revealed that faith is not about certainty, but about fidelity. To remain faithful in confusion is the highest form of worship. This sacred protest, this wrestling with the divine, continues in every generation. The world is filled with modern Jobs, men and women who suffer without explanation, who cry out into silence, who wrestle with faith amid loss. The book of Job gives them permission to speak, to question, to lament. It tells them that their cries are not blasphemy, but the sound of faith alive. The divine silence that surrounds them is not empty. It is full of presence waiting to be discovered. The wrestling, though painful, is the way the soul learns to know God intimately. As Job's speeches draw toward their end, we can sense that something within him has shifted. The fire of accusation cools into the warmth of longing. The God he once challenged, he now desires. His demand for explanation fades into a deeper hunger to see, to encounter, to know. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. This declaration, emerging from the ashes of despair, marks the birth of hope. It is not the naive hope of comfort, but the mature hope of faith, tested by fire. Job's protest has led him to the threshold of vision. Faith born of struggle is the only faith that endures. It is forged in the silence of unanswered prayers, in the loneliness of misunderstood pain, in the darkness where the divine seems absent. Yet, paradoxically, that is where God is most near. The wrestling does not end with victory in the human sense. It ends with surrender, with the realization that the purpose of faith is not to solve the mystery of suffering, but to stand in it faithfully. Job's sacred protest teaches that questioning God is not betrayal, but intimacy. It is the dialogue of love stretched to its breaking point, only to find that it cannot break. The story of Job invites us to bring our whole selves before God, our anger, our confusion, our longing, our silence. The divine relationship does not require perfect words, it requires presence. God meets us not in our certainties, but in our honesty. In that meeting, even our accusations become prayers, our doubts become doorways, our tears become theology. The one who wrestles with God walks away changed, not because he wins, but because he has seen the face of the mystery and lived. The protest of Job is therefore sacred. It reminds us that the highest act of faith is not blind acceptance, but courageous engagement. To wrestle with God is to love him with the fullness of our being, to trust him enough to confront him, to believe enough to demand his presence. In that struggle, heaven's silence becomes a living conversation, and the soul, though wounded, is made whole. If you feel the strength of this message and wish to keep walking through the depth of spiritual wisdom and endurance, remember to subscribe to the channel so you can continue this journey of reflection, truth, and faith that transcends suffering. When God finally speaks, the whirlwind and the mystery of presence, After long nights of anguish, after words have burned themselves out and silence has become a second skin, something extraordinary happens in the book of Job. God speaks. The long-awaited voice breaks through the stillness, not in a whisper of comfort, but in a storm. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. This single line shifts the entire landscape of the story. Heaven, once silent, now roars. The God who seemed absent emerges in thunder and wind, a force of raw creation that shakes the foundations of the world. Yet what follows is not what Job or the reader expects. God does not explain, does not justify, does not even mention the reasons for Job's suffering. Instead, he questions Job, not to humiliate him but to awaken him. The encounter reveals that divine speech is not always about answers. It is about revelation. Job wanted information. God gives him vision. The whirlwind becomes a symbol of divine presence that transcends understanding. God's first words are a challenge. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? To human ears, it may sound like rebuke, but beneath it lies invitation. God is calling Job into dialogue, summoning him from complaint to contemplation. The whirlwind strips away illusion, forcing Job to see creation not from the narrow view of human suffering, but from the vast perspective of divine wisdom. Through a series of rhetorical questions, God takes Job on a cosmic journey, from the foundations of the earth to the boundaries of the sea, from the constellations of the heavens to the wildness of animals. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. With every question, God reveals the limits of human knowledge and the immensity of his own. Yet these questions are not meant to crush Job, but to free him from the tyranny of explanation, from the belief that life must be understood to be meaningful. In the whirlwind's voice, there is no accusation, only awe. God's questions reframe reality itself. The focus shifts from human suffering to cosmic harmony. Job had demanded an answer to the problem of injustice, but God answers with the mystery of creation. The message is not that Job's pain is insignificant, but that it is part of something infinitely greater than he can imagine. The divine response does not solve the riddle of evil. It reveals a world teeming with purpose, beauty, and complexity beyond the reach of human comprehension. God's silence has given birth to something deeper than an answer, a revelation of presence that redefines the nature of faith itself. The whirlwind is more than a storm. It is a metaphor for the divine reality that cannot be contained by human thought. When God speaks out of chaos, he reminds Job that creation itself was born from the same chaos. The order of the world arises from the divine will that moves through what seems disordered. Thus, the whirlwind is not destruction, but creation in motion. It is a reminder that God's ways are not arbitrary, but woven into the fabric of existence. The same force that commands the lightning also feeds the ravens, births the mountain goats, and watches over the smallest creatures. Through this vision, Job begins to see that divine governance is not limited to human notions of justice. God cares for all creation, not just humankind. The universe, vast and alive, is the stage of a wisdom that transcends moral calculation. Job's suffering, seen from this cosmic perspective, is not meaningless. It is part of the intricate dance of existence that no single human mind can grasp. The encounter with the whirlwind marks the turning point of Job's journey. The man who once demanded explanation now finds himself speechless before majesty. Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand upon my mouth. This is not humiliation. It is illumination. Job's silence now is different from the silence of despair that preceded it. Before, he was silent because God would not speak. Now he is silent because words are no longer adequate. The mystery of God has filled the void. What once felt like absence now feels like fullness. The silence of heaven has turned into the overwhelming presence of divine reality. Job's questions are not answered, yet they are dissolved in a vision so vast that answers become irrelevant. The divine discourse continues with vivid imagery of creatures beyond human control, Behemoth and Leviathan, symbols of untamed power. These monstrous beings embody the forces of chaos that dwell within creation, forces that even humans fear. Yet God delights in them. He describes them with joy, as if to say that even the wildest, most uncontrollable aspects of existence belong to his design. For Job, this is a revelation that changes everything. Suffering, like Leviathan, is not evil in itself. It is part of the divine mystery that sustains the universe. To love God is to accept even what one cannot understand. The divine order includes both light and darkness, creation and destruction, birth and death. This vision transforms Job's pain into awe. He sees that God's sovereignty does not exclude suffering. It redeems it by weaving it into a pattern too intricate for mortal eyes. In this encounter, God never apologizes or explains. This silence within the speech is significant. It suggests that the divine does not justify himself to human reason because his nature is not accountable to it. The relationship between God and humanity is not a contract, but a covenant, a bond of love, not of logic. God's response out of the whirlwind reminds us that the deepest faith is not built on comprehension, but on trust in divine mystery. The world is not random, but neither is it simple. The order that governs creation is beyond our grasp, yet it invites reverence. Job's lesson is not that suffering is good, but that even in suffering, God is present. His voice may come through thunder, but it carries tenderness. His questions may sound overwhelming, but they are the language of love, calling the soul into maturity. Job's transformation becomes evident in his final confession. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. And these words mark the climax of his spiritual journey. Until now, Job's faith was based on tradition and inherited knowledge. He believed in God because he had been taught to believe. But now, through the furnace of suffering and the silence of heaven, his faith has become sight. He no longer knows God second-hand. He has encountered him directly. This is the ultimate purpose of the silence and the whirlwind, revelation that transcends doctrine. Job's understanding of God is no longer theoretical, it is experiential. His theology has turned into encounter, his religion into relationship. The phrase, "Now my eye sees you," is one of the most profound declarations in all spiritual literature. It implies that suffering, when endured with faith, can open the inner vision of the soul. Job's vision is not of a God who explains, but of a God who is. Presence replaces understanding as the foundation of belief. When the heart truly encounters the divine, it no longer needs reasons. It rests in awe. This is what mystics across centuries have described as enlightenment or union, the point at which the soul ceases to demand and begins to behold. Job's eye sees not because his questions were answered, but because his perspective was transformed. He now perceives that the divine reality encompasses both his joy and his pain, both his loss and his restoration. The God who seemed silent has been speaking all along, through creation, through suffering, through the very silence that once tormented him. The transformation that follows is not merely spiritual, but existential. Job's restoration at the end of the story is often misunderstood as a simple reward. The doubling of his wealth, the birth of new children, the return of prosperity, these are not compensations for his loss. They symbolize renewal, resurrection, the fruit of inner transformation. The outward blessing mirrors the inward awakening. The God Job meets in the whirlwind is not the God of transaction, but the God of being, the source of all that is. Job's restoration, therefore, is not a reversal of misfortune, but the flowering of wisdom born through suffering. His life becomes a testimony that faith, purified by fire, can transcend the boundaries of reason and enter the mystery of grace. In the larger biblical narrative, Job's encounter anticipates the later revelation of divine love in the suffering of Christ. The whirlwind of Job foreshadows the cross, where God again speaks, not in thunder but in silence, through the mystery of suffering love. On Calvary, the silence of heaven becomes incarnate. There, too, God does not explain but reveals. The divine response to human pain is not an argument, but an act of presence, the infinite entering the finite to bear its burden. Job's story thus becomes a prophecy of redemption. His encounter with the whirlwind prepares humanity to recognize that divine mystery is not cruel but compassionate, that even in silence, God is working toward resurrection. The beauty of God's speech lies also in its poetry. The questions are not legal arguments, but songs of creation. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? Each image draws the listener into the wonder of the cosmos. God's poetry teaches theology not through definition, but through imagination. The divine voice does not appeal to intellect alone. It awakens the soul to marvel. This is a profound shift. Faith is no longer about explanation, but about participation. Job is invited to see himself not as a victim of injustice, but as part of a living universe sustained by divine wisdom. His suffering has not been meaningless. It has been the dark soil from which new vision grows. The whirlwind has become his teacher. One might still ask, why does God choose the whirlwind? Why not appear as a comforting presence or a gentle voice? Perhaps because true revelation requires disruption. The whirlwind symbolizes the breaking of old certainties. It is the collapse of control, the shattering of illusions. Only when the structures of understanding fall can the soul perceive the vastness of divine reality. The whirlwind is God's way of freeing Job from the smallness of his theology. It replaces explanation with encounter, doctrine with wonder. What seems violent is actually healing, the destruction of falsehood to make room for truth. In this sense, the whirlwind is grace in motion, divine mercy disguised as storm. Job's response to the whirlwind completes his transformation. He repents, but not in the way we often think of repentance, as guilt for wrongdoing. The Hebrew word used here, nacham, means to be comforted, to change one's mind, to be transformed by new understanding. Job's repentance is not for sin, but for limited vision. He turns from demanding answers to embracing mystery. In this turning, he finds peace. The whirlwind has not crushed him. It has awakened him to the grandeur of existence. His heart, once heavy with complaint, now rests in awe. He no longer needs to defend himself or accuse God. The dialogue that began in anguish ends in reverence. The final silence after God's speech is not emptiness, it is fulfillment. Job's story moves from silence to speech and back to silence again, but the second silence is different. It is the silence of understanding beyond words, the silence of communion. When the whirlwind subsides, the world is not the same. Job's soul has been expanded to contain mystery. The God who once seemed distant now fills all things. This transformation is the true miracle of the book, greater even than the restoration of Job's fortunes. It reveals that the purpose of divine silence and speech alike is union. The silence prepared Job's heart. The whirlwind opened his eyes. The encounter made him whole. The lesson for every reader is timeless. When God finally speaks in our lives, it may not be with explanations or resolutions. It may come as disruption, as awe, as the shattering of our certainties. But within that storm lies revelation. The divine does not conform to our expectations because the divine is infinite. The purpose of faith is not to master God, but to be mastered by wonder. Like Job, we must learn to listen with the heart rather than the mind, to recognize that the answer to suffering is not knowledge, but presence. when the whirlwind passes. What remains is not clarity, but communion. Job's encounter with the whirlwind stands as one of the most profound depictions of the meeting between finite and infinite. It captures the paradox at the heart of faith, that God's silence and speech are not opposites but two movements of the same divine symphony. In silence, he invites. In speech, he reveals. In both, he loves. The whirlwind teaches that God's voice cannot be confined to human categories. It is found in creation, in chaos, in beauty, in sorrow. It speaks through the wind, through loss, through the trembling of the heart that still dares to believe. Job's journey from complaint to awe mirrors the spiritual path of all who seek God, not the path of easy answers, but of transformation through mystery. By the end of the story, Job has become something greater than he was before. He has moved beyond moral innocence into spiritual wisdom. His faith is no longer dependent on blessings. It stands rooted in direct encounter. The man who once cried for justice now rests in reverence. The one who demanded an explanation now beholds the unexplainable. The whirlwind has not destroyed his faith, it has fulfilled it. This is the paradoxical triumph of the book. The silence of heaven, which seemed like abandonment, was the prelude to revelation. The suffering that seemed meaningless became the doorway to vision. Job's story ends not with resolution, but with transformation. The divine mystery remains, but the soul is at peace within it. So when the whirlwind comes in our own lives, when the familiar collapses, when prayers go unanswered, when we stand bewildered before the chaos, we may remember Job. The voice that spoke to him still speaks through the tempests of our days. It may not explain, but it will reveal. It may not soothe, but it will awaken. It may not answer, but it will be present. And in that presence, the heart will know what the mind cannot grasp, that even in the whirlwind, we are not alone. If these words help you glimpse the beauty hidden within life's storms, remember to subscribe to the channel so you can continue this journey of wisdom, faith, and the divine mystery that speaks even through silence. Faith reborn, the quiet redemption beyond the storm. When the whirlwind passes and the thunder fades into stillness, Job stands changed. The man who began his journey with anguish and accusation now rests in a peace that surpasses understanding. He has walked through loss, silence, protest, and revelation. Now, at the end, what remains is not the restoration of wealth or the comfort of new beginnings. It is a renewed vision of faith itself. The book closes with a quiet yet profound statement. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends. This sentence, so simple, conceals the culmination of an entire spiritual transformation. Job's restoration is not just material. It is symbolic of redemption, reconciliation, and the reawakening of faith after desolation. His world has been rebuilt from ashes, but more importantly, his heart has been reborn through divine encounter. What is redemption, if not the rediscovery of God after despair? Job's story reminds us that redemption does not erase suffering, it transfigures it. The same God who seemed absent now fills the air around him. The silence that once tormented him has become a sacred space of awareness. Through his ordeal, Job has learned that faith cannot depend on comfort or explanation. It must exist even when heaven is mute. That is the essence of mature belief, to trust not because God answers, but because God is. Job's suffering has carved out within him a capacity for awe that prosperity could never have given. His losses have made room for deeper vision. The storm has cleared his eyes. When the narrative says God restored Job's fortunes twice as much as he had before, it is not merely an accounting of camels and sheep. It is the language of completeness, of restoration in spirit and creation. The doubling represents abundance, not of possessions, but of understanding. Job's wealth returns, but his perception of wealth has changed. What once defined him externally now flows from within. He knows now that all things, joy and sorrow alike, belong to the rhythm of divine life. His faith, tested and refined, has reached the point where it no longer fears loss. What can be taken from a soul that has already met the infinite? In this moment of quiet redemption, Job does something extraordinary. He prays for his friends. These are the same men who, in his deepest anguish, accused him, misunderstood him, and added insult to his suffering. Yet Job intercedes for them, and God accepts his prayer. Forgiveness becomes the final act of faith. It is the seal of transformation. Job's capacity to forgive reveals that suffering has not hardened him. It has purified him. Through pain, he has learned compassion. Through misunderstanding, he has learned mercy. His prayer for his friends marks the completion of his spiritual journey. He no longer sees himself as the center of his pain, but as a conduit of grace. Redemption, then, is not merely about God restoring Job, it is about Job reflecting God. The profound truth of this moment is that prayer itself has changed. Job no longer prays to demand or defend. He prays out of love. He prays because he has seen the face of the mystery and cannot remain silent. The one who once wrestled with God now becomes an intercessor for others. His voice, once filled with complaint, now becomes a channel of healing. In this reversal lies the essence of redemption, the transformation of lament into compassion. It is not that Job forgets his suffering, he transcends it. Pain has taught him empathy. The darkness he endured becomes the light he now offers to others. This final stage of Job's story carries a lesson that stretches beyond theology. It touches the core of human experience. Every life in its own way passes through a similar arc. We encounter loss, confusion, and silence. We wrestle with the divine and with ourselves. We demand meaning where none seems to exist. But if we endure, if we stay faithful to the search, the storm eventually gives way to stillness. And in that stillness, something within us awakens. The same person who entered suffering is not the one who emerges. Job's transformation mirrors the transformation possible for every soul that dares to remain open through pain. The end of suffering is not the restoration of what was lost, it is the birth of what is eternal. Job's redemption also reveals something profound about the nature of God. The divine does not merely reward obedience or punish disobedience. He accompanies, transforms, and redeems. God's silence was not absence, it was preparation. The whirlwind was not wrath, it was revelation. The restoration is not compensation, it is communion. Through every stage of Job's journey, God has been shaping him into the image of faith itself, resilient, honest, unyielding in love. The same man who once said, "I cry out, but you do not answer," now speaks with peace because he has learned that the divine presence transcends speech. In knowing God beyond words, Job becomes part of the eternal conversation between heaven and earth. There is something quietly revolutionary in the way Job's story ends. The ancient world often saw suffering as punishment and prosperity as divine favor. But the book of Job breaks that pattern forever. It proclaims that faithfulness cannot be measured by success, nor suffering by guilt. The righteous may suffer, not because they are being punished, but because they are being refined. Job's experience teaches that suffering, rather than disproving God, can become the deepest revelation of Him. This is not a message of resignation, it is a call to depth. To live by faith is to accept that divine love may sometimes come disguised as silence, and that grace often enters through wounds. In the stillness after the whirlwind, Job's life unfolds anew. He has more children, more wealth, more years, but these are no longer the measure of his worth. The text tells us that his daughters were the most beautiful in the land and that he gave them inheritance alongside their brothers, a radical act in its time. This gesture reveals the transformation of his soul. Having tasted divine compassion, Job now lives by it. His restored life becomes a mirror of divine justice. Inclusive and merciful, what was once a man crying out for fairness has become a man embodying it. The storm has not only changed his relationship with God, but with humanity itself. He now gives freely, seeing all life as sacred, all creatures as part of the same divine order revealed in the whirlwind. The final verse tells us that Job died old and full of days. The phrase carries the sense of completeness, of a life fully lived and fully understood. His story begins with abundance, falls into desolation, and ends in abundance again. But the second abundance is different. It is not the wealth of possessions, but the wealth of understanding. Job's life, once shattered, becomes a parable of renewal. The one who once cursed the day of his birth now blesses the days of his existence. He has discovered that even in the silence of God there is music. Even in the ashes of loss there is creation waiting to be born. Job's quiet redemption teaches us that faith does not shield us from suffering. It gives us the strength to transform suffering into wisdom. When God finally speaks, it is not to justify, but to reveal. And when he restores, it is not to erase, but to renew. The silence, the questions, the whirlwind, all were steps toward this moment of reconciliation. Job's journey thus becomes the spiritual anatomy of faith itself. The cry, the silence, the wrestling, the vision, and the peace. These stages do not follow a linear path. They are the rhythm of every soul's relationship with the divine. In every life, there are seasons of silence and seasons of speech, times of anguish and times of awe. The story of Job tells us that all of them are sacred. Perhaps the most important truth in Job's redemption is that it does not depend on explanation. Even at the end, God never tells Job why he suffered. The mystery remains. But it no longer needs to be solved, because Job has learned to live within it. Faith, he discovers, is not the ability to eliminate mystery, but the courage to dwell inside it peacefully. This is the final stage of spiritual maturity, to rest in what cannot be known, to trust in what cannot be seen. The peace that Job attains is not ignorance, it is transcendence. He has become one with the rhythm of creation, part of the harmony that God revealed in the whirlwind. His life, once broken by loss, now flows in tune with the music of the cosmos. For readers across centuries, Job's story has remained one of the most profound explorations of human suffering and divine mystery. It speaks to those who have lost, who have waited, who have prayed into silence. It assures them that the silence of God is not the end of the story. Faith may falter, but it can be reborn stronger. The human heart may break, but it can be reshaped into something vast enough to contain awe. The journey of Job is not unique to him. It is the journey of all who live with faith in a world that often seems unjust. His endurance becomes our map through despair. His vision becomes our hope. His final peace becomes the promise that beyond every silence lies a voice, and beyond every storm, a dawn. Job's restoration also carries a hidden moral dimension about reconciliation, not only with God, but with life itself. Suffering often divides the soul from the world. It creates alienation, bitterness, detachment. But Job's prayer for his friends marks his return to communion. He re-enters the human community, not as one who demands understanding, but as one who offers it. His pain has taught him solidarity with all who suffer. This is the true fruit of spiritual awakening, the ability to love more deeply because one has suffered more deeply. Job's faith, once personal and defensive, has become universal and generous. He embodies what it means to forgive, to rebuild, to bless even after being broken. In this light, Job's story can be seen as a movement from transactional religion to transformative relationship. At the beginning, his faith operated within a moral economy. Obedience produced blessing, disobedience produced punishment. But by the end, that framework has collapsed. The God Job now knows is beyond reward and retribution. Divine love does not operate on human logic. It simply is. It embraces both joy and sorrow, both justice and mystery. This revelation frees Job from the anxiety of control. He no longer worships to secure outcomes. He worships because he has seen the truth. This shift is the essence of spiritual freedom. The believer, who no longer depends on circumstances to affirm faith, has reached the threshold of union with God. The transformation of Job's heart is mirrored in the way the narrative ends, with blessing flowing outward. Job's new life is not inwardly focused, it is expansive. He becomes a source of light for others. His ability to bless those who wronged him demonstrates that divine grace has truly taken root in him. The storm has passed, but its lessons remain. Job now understands that the power of faith is not in controlling life's events, but in meeting them with trust. The silence of God has taught him to listen. The whirlwind has taught him to see. Through it all, he has learned that every experience, no matter how dark, carries the imprint of the divine. The book of Job closes not with triumphant clarity, but with sacred mystery. It ends as it began, in the tension between heaven and earth, between human frailty and divine majesty. Yet the difference is everything. The man who once trembled before silence now stands at peace within it. The faith that once demanded answers now lives in awe. Job's redemption is not the restoration of what was lost. It is the realization that nothing was truly lost, for God was present in all of it, even in absence. That is the secret at the heart of the book. The presence of God is not limited to speech or silence, blessing or suffering. It pervades all. To see this is to be free. In the end, Job's faith becomes the prototype of all enduring faith. It is the kind that survives the collapse of certainty, that keeps breathing in the dark, that stands upright even when kneeling before the incomprehensible. It is faith that has been through fire and come out refined like gold. Job's story, therefore, does not merely comfort the afflicted. It transforms the meaning of affliction itself. Suffering becomes not a curse, but a crucible, not an end, but a passage. Redemption in Job's world is not escape, it is awakening. It is the discovery that love remains, that God remains, even when all else falls away. When we read the final lines and close the book, we are left not with explanations, but with invitation to live as Job lived after the storm, humbled, open, compassionate, and unafraid of silence. For silence now carries meaning. It has become a sign of divine mystery dwelling within us. The story of Job ends, but its echo continues in every life that chooses faith over despair, love over bitterness, trust over understanding. In the silence that follows the whirlwind, we too may hear, faint but eternal, the whisper that says, "All has not been lost. It has only been transformed." If this journey through Job's faith and redemption has touched your heart, remember to subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring together the eternal wisdom that helps us endure, understand, and transcend life's deepest mysteries.